In 1776, the idea of an independent America sounded completely absurd. Across the Atlantic Ocean stood the British Empire, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Britain controlled global trade, dominated the seas with the greatest navy on Earth, and possessed a professional army feared across continents. Its empire stretched from Europe to the Caribbean, from India to North America. People often said the sun never set on the British Empire because somewhere in the world, British territory was always under daylight. Against that colossal power stood 13 divided colonies, clinging to the eastern coastline of North America. They had no real central government, no standing army, almost no navy, little money, and almost no military industry. Most of the men who would eventually fight the British were not trained soldiers at all. They were farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, laborers, merchants, and young boys carrying muskets into battle against one of the deadliest military machines in history. By every logical standard, the rebellion should have failed quickly. Britain itself believed the war would be over in months. Many Europeans laughed at the idea that colonial militias could ever defeat the empire that had crushed powerful European rivals for generations. Even inside the colonies, there were many people who doubted independence was possible. And yet, within only a few years, those colonies achieved what the world believed was impossible. They defeated the British Empire and created the United States of America. But to understand how America won, you first have to understand why the colonies rebelled in the first place. For decades before the Revolution, the American colonies had prospered under British rule. Britain protected colonial trade routes and defended the colonies from rival European powers like France and Spain. Many colonists considered themselves proud British subjects. But everything began to change after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Britain had defeated France and gained massive territory in North America, but victory came at an enormous cost. The British government was drowning in debt and believed the colonies should help pay for the war that had protected them. New taxes soon followed. The Stamp Act taxed printed materials such as newspapers, legal documents, and licenses. The Townshend Acts imposed taxes on imported goods like tea, glass, and paper. To British politicians, these taxes seemed reasonable, but to many colonists, they represented something much deeper and more dangerous. The colonies had no representatives in Parliament. They had no direct voice in the government imposing these taxes. Across taverns and city streets, one phrase spread rapidly through the colonies: no taxation without representation. Tensions escalated year after year. British soldiers were increasingly stationed in colonial cities to maintain order, especially in Boston, where resistance against British rule became particularly intense. Many colonists viewed the soldiers not as protectors, but as occupiers. Arguments between civilians and troops became common. Then, on March 5, 1770, everything exploded. During a confrontation in Boston, British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists. 5 men were killed. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Patriot leaders used it as propaganda to inflame anti-British anger throughout the colonies. Engravings depicting British soldiers slaughtering civilians spread rapidly, fueling outrage and resentment. But the true breaking point came in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. Britain had granted the East India Company special privileges, allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants. In response, a group of colonists disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors boarded British ships in Boston Harbor during the night. They smashed open hundreds of tea chests and dumped them into the icy water below. It was one of the boldest acts of defiance against British authority the colonies had ever seen. Britain responded furiously. Parliament passed what became known as the Intolerable Acts, punishing Massachusetts severely. Boston Harbor was closed. Colonial self-government was restricted. British authority tightened across the region. But instead of crushing resistance, Britain united the colonies against itself. Representatives from the colonies gathered in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. Some still hoped for peace, but many understood that war was becoming unavoidable. That war officially began on April 19, 1775. British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, intending to seize colonial weapons and arrest patriot leaders. But colonial militias already knew the British were coming. Riders such as Paul Revere spread warnings through the countryside during the night. By dawn, armed militiamen stood waiting in Lexington. No one knows who fired the first shot. But suddenly, gunfire erupted. The American Revolution had begun. As British troops continued toward Concord, colonial resistance intensified. On the return march to Boston, thousands of militiamen attacked British soldiers from behind trees, fences, houses, and stone walls. The British suffered hundreds of casualties during the retreat. The message was now clear to both sides. This was no longer a political dispute. It was war. Soon after, the colonies appointed George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. Washington was not chosen simply because of military experience. He represented unity. As a Virginian, he helped unite Southern colonies with the rebellion centered in New England. Standing over 6 feet tall, calm under pressure, and respected throughout the colonies, Washington quickly became the face of the Revolution itself. But the situation he inherited was catastrophic. The Continental Army was poorly equipped, poorly trained, and dangerously underfunded. Soldiers often lacked food, blankets, proper uniforms, ammunition, and even shoes. Many men enlisted for short periods before returning home. Desertion was common. Disease spread constantly through military camps. Smallpox alone threatened to destroy the army more effectively than British bullets. Meanwhile, Britain continued deploying experienced professional soldiers supported by the world's strongest navy. In 1776, Britain launched a massive campaign to capture New York City. More than 30,000 British and Hessian troops arrived, making it one of the largest military operations of the century. Washington's army was heavily outnumbered and badly outmatched. Battle after battle ended in American retreats. New York eventually fell into British hands. Thousands of American soldiers were killed, captured, or scattered. At several moments, the Revolution itself nearly collapsed. Many Americans began losing hope. Some soldiers deserted. Others refused to re-enlist. British commanders believed final victory was close. Thomas Paine, desperate to restore morale, published The American Crisis, opening with the now famous line, "These are the times that try men's souls." Then, during one of the darkest moments of the war, George Washington made one of the boldest decisions in American history. On Christmas night in 1776, Washington led his exhausted army across the frozen Delaware River during a brutal winter storm. Ice filled the river. Snow and freezing rain battered the men as they crossed in darkness. Many soldiers lacked boots, leaving bloody footprints in the snow during the march toward Trenton, New Jersey. But Washington knew the Revolution desperately needed a victory to survive. At dawn, the Americans launched a surprise attack against Hessian mercenaries stationed in the town. The attack was devastatingly effective. The stunned Hessians quickly surrendered. The victory at Trenton electrified the colonies. It proved the Continental Army could still fight. More importantly, it restored belief in the Revolution itself. Washington followed the victory with another successful engagement at Princeton. Suddenly, the Revolution no longer looked hopeless. Still, Britain remained overwhelmingly powerful. British strategy evolved. They believed the rebellion could be crushed by isolating New England from the southern colonies. In 1777, British General John Burgoyne led a large army south from Canada toward New York. But American forces surrounded and defeated Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga changed the entire war. The victory shocked Europe. Until then, France had secretly supported the Americans with supplies and money, but hesitated to openly join what still looked like a doomed rebellion. Saratoga convinced the French government that the Americans actually had a chance to win. In 1778, France officially entered the war as an ally of the United States. This was a disaster for Britain. The war was no longer simply a colonial rebellion. It had become a global conflict. French warships challenged British naval supremacy. French troops and military supplies poured into America. Spain and the Dutch Republic would eventually join the conflict against Britain as well. British resources became stretched across multiple continents and oceans. Meanwhile, George Washington continued fighting a war of survival. He understood he did not need to destroy the British Army in one decisive battle. He only needed to prevent the revolution from dying. As long as the Continental Army survived, Britain could never fully claim victory. One of the harshest moments of the war came during the winter at Valley Forge between 1777 and 1778. Thousands of American soldiers suffered terribly from hunger, disease, and freezing temperatures. Men died from exposure and starvation. Many lacked coats or proper shelter. Yet despite unimaginable suffering, the army endured. At Valley Forge, a former Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben transformed the Continental Army. He drilled soldiers relentlessly, teaching discipline, battlefield maneuvers, and professional military tactics. By spring, Washington's army had become far more effective and organized. The war increasingly shifted southward. British commanders believed they could rally loyalist support in the southern colonies and isolate the rebellion there. Brutal fighting erupted across the Carolinas and Georgia. The Southern campaign became savage and personal. Raids, ambushes, executions, and guerrilla warfare devastated entire communities. American commanders, such as Nathaniel Greene, adopted strategies designed to exhaust British forces rather than seek direct destruction. Greene often retreated strategically, forcing British armies to chase Americans across difficult terrain while suffering losses and supply shortages. Greene famously said, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." The British won several battles in the South, but every victory drained their strength further. By 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army into Yorktown, Virginia. Cornwallis believed his coastal position would allow the Royal Navy to support and evacuate his troops if necessary, but events were already moving against him. George Washington and French General Rochambeau coordinated a massive operation against Yorktown. At the same time, the French Navy moved into position offshore. In September 1781, the French fleet defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, preventing British reinforcements or evacuation by sea. Cornwallis was trapped. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown and began a relentless siege. Day and night, artillery bombardments pounded British defenses. Trenches crept closer toward British lines. Supplies dwindled. Casualties mounted. Cornwallis desperately waited for rescue that never came. Then, on October 19, 1781, the impossible happened. A British army surrendered to the Americans. As British troops marched out to surrender, legend says their military band played "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether true or not, the phrase perfectly captured the moment. The greatest empire on earth had been defeated by a rebellion everyone believed would fail. The war formally ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, where Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. The victory transformed world history forever. The American Revolution proved that even the strongest empire could be challenged by ordinary people fighting for self-government and liberty. It inspired revolutions across Europe and Latin America. It reshaped global politics forever. But America's victory came at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands died during the war. Cities were destroyed. Families were divided. The new nation faced enormous uncertainty. Yet despite everything, the United States survived. And perhaps that is why the story still resonates centuries later, because this was never simply a story about military victory. It was the story of impossible odds, of farmers standing against an empire, of freezing soldiers crossing rivers in darkness, of men risking execution by signing their names to independence, of an idea so powerful that people were willing to die for it. Against all expectations, against the strongest empire on earth, America won.